and gentlemen, I am OmnusI, here in my lair once more, with you for another RPGaDay video. Today is the penultimate day for August the 30th. Sad. But here we are. We always get to this point in the year and it almost seems a relief because we've been doing, a lot of these videos, and for a pace that a torrid pace can be good for some things, but I've already got a fairly full plate, so it'll be a little relaxing. I might take a little bit of time off after this, so if you are coming to the lair to look at new videos, I've got a couple that I'll probably throw up, but it might be a little bit before I shoot some more. On the other hand, I'm pretty happy that I've backed into a new wardrobe of costumes that I kind of got a little too big for before, but as I am losing weight, that's giving me some options. Sorry to bore you. Anyhow, today the word is portal. Portal's a great word. But a portal is nothing less and nothing more than a way, a place, an aperture to go from one place to another. Oftentimes, the idea is that portal, especially used in the context of fantasy, is that it goes from one place to someplace very different, not just the space beyond the portal. Although technically, a portal is a doorway. So it can mean, okay, I open up the door to the portal and I walk through into the bathroom, which is fine. But in this case, we're talking about going from one place to someplace very different. And in this case, I'm going to talk about my dice file game. If you're tired of it, I'm sorry. You should probably be checking out another YouTube channel that does other videos. But this year, this is what I wanted to focus on. So, part of the idea, I think, of a good role-playing game is how well it plays with others. And in this case, I'm not talking about the group and the dynamics of that. I'm talking, in this case, what happens if you take a game and then you take something from outside of that game and you want to use it because it's got a lot of good ideas? How easy is it to port something from one system to another? Sometimes that's really challenging, even if you go from one edition to another edition. For instance, I've got several books over there, 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. It's tough to take and use in 3rd edition or 5th edition because the mechanics changed quite a bit in those games. What the value of hit points are changed completely. So, for example, even though the number of hit points that you might end up with in 3rd edition and 4th edition might seem similar, because, well, quite honestly, the amount of hit points in 4th edition really got ramped up so your characters are more survivable, and there's a number of different abilities and talents and attribute increases you could do to give yourself a ridiculous number of hit points in 3rd edition. Even if the average character has less, I would say. But, on the other hand, the amount of damage that you generally deal out in 4th edition is less than what you are capable of doing in 3rd edition. So when monsters have 300 or 400 hit points, that's because your characters are able at higher levels to do crazy amounts of damage. And we've seen different combinations and abilities that really, can be shocking to a dungeon master who's not prepared. But in 4th edition, the curve is a lot milder. So, But in this case, I'm going to talk about taking my game, Dice File, and adapting other game systems. And I grabbed 3 at random from my collection. And maybe these will, give you a smile. We'll see. So, and I tried to go for a wide variety of games. So the first one we're going with is one of the more common analogs, Swords and Wizardry, which is a retro clone of Dungeons & Dragons. This harkens back to the 0 edition to 1st edition level of gameplay. It didn't go for adding a lot of extra mechanics to it. Relatively straightforward. If you've played Dungeons & Dragons, this will feel very familiar to you. There are some important differences, however. They've added some more complex classes from the spirit of 1st edition, advanced Dungeons & Dragons, like, you've got your monks and your assassins, and there's paladins and rangers and such. And you have the different races and the like. but the game is written in a much more, well, it's less arcane. It's not written at the high level that Gygax's books were written at. It's more approachable, and you can pick this book up and read it and not have to go through a lot of decanting what the meaning is behind a lot of things. This is just easier to pick up and play. And again, as you know, Dungeons & Dragons is fairly well balanced. Most people who have played it know kind of how it goes. So going from Dungeons & Dragons to Swords and Wizardry is actually very simple. It's going to be a little bit of a shock to people who've played only 3rd edition, 4th or 5th edition, but you'll still understand the core concepts behind fantasy adventuring. How does Dicefile deal with this? Well, a lot of the things that are in this book are powers and abilities. Your characters have basic attributes. Cool, so does Dicefile. Dicefile has basic attributes. And if you wanted to just rip them right out of here and apply them to Dicefile, sure, you could do that. If you wanted to say, yeah, your character can have a strength attribute, a dexterity attribute, an intelligence attribute, a wisdom attribute, that's fine. It wouldn't offend me if you did that, because it's just reskinning, and that's fine. Or you could just look at the mechanics, the things that I have. You know, most of them are deliberately not named the same as Dungeons & Dragons and the retro clones, because I don't want my game to be exactly the same. So instead of strength, you have muscle. And muscle can be used for a variety of things. But then after that, what do you have? Well, you have your to-hit bonus, as represented on a matrix. In my game, you have skill. And instead of having a disparity between how your skills go up based on your profession, my game doesn't really have professions. It has your character concept, which helps determine how your character is advancing if you're playing in with your concept. But then, since you kind of choose the direction your character is going to grow and develop in, if you want to be better at combat, you develop the skills to help you to be better at combat. And more often, you're going to roll higher results that will give you a better chance of hitting more difficult targets. Just like Dungeons & Dragons and the like. So, yeah, as far as that goes, combat, it's just mastering those skills. Now, one thing that Swords and Wizardry and a lot of the D&D games don't have is an elaborate skills set. It was basically determined back then that you are the player, who gave your characters their skills. So you would actually say what your character does, and the Dungeon Master would interpret if your character can do those things. And if they determine that it's possible, then you did it. If not, then you couldn't. Well, I have skills, so that makes it relatively straightforward to plug in what is what. Now, things like armor class. You might think that might be a little bit difficult, but honestly, if you understand that I have rated, say, leather armor at a D4 defense, chainmail at D6 defense, plate mail at D8 defense, and full gothic plate at D10, then it's really not hard to figure out armor class. If something has an armor class of, say, if you go on a descending scale, like original Dungeons & Dragons, say something has an armor class of 0, that's equivalent of a D10 defense. Then you have to decide, is that because of their armor? Is that because of like their body thickness? Is it armor plus an element of agility that helps with that? Or a shield defense skill? Not terribly difficult, because there's only so many things that can do it, but you can then represent that by dice if you want to. Now, if it's an NPC, if it's a monster, you don't need to worry about that. You just need to give it a number, a target number that the players will end up having to hit. Unless you want to play the element where the Game Master basically is playing as the characters, and then you would need to know which dice they would end up rolling for all of that. But realistically, a tough creature, like, say, a dragon, might have a very high armor, say a D10 for its scaly hide, and it may also have an extra D8 because of its mass. It's hard to hurt. And bulk is a trait which can help you on your defense. But again, you have to be considerably bigger than human to get that bonus. And in this case, then, your characters may have a hard time hurting such a creature because the numbers are on their side. Now, if your dragon rolls low and the characters roll high, congratulations, you rolled your critical success possibly, or you found that gap in the armor, much like Smough with his missing scale that spelled his doom. You find that gap, slid your weapon up the scales of the armor, and you dealt a major blow. Perfectly possible, can be represented in the game without too much difficulty. Magic. Magic is kind of a complex thing in Dungeons and Dragons, and it can be more complicated in my game. You have die ratings for the various paths of magic. So necromancy, life magic, elementalism, war magery. If you wanted to tie that in with Dungeons and Dragons and take stuff directly out of there, magic's broken up into schools in Dungeons and Dragons. So you can have abjuration, conjuration, evocation, necromancy if you want. That's perfectly fine. And then, if you want, you could have a breakdown of individual skills in the spells if you wanted to. So if you wanted to learn, say, Magic Missile, you learn it at a D4 level of skill. Then you would roll against your evocation, I think? I believe it's evocation, maybe conjuration. That die plus your skill in that skill, and you basically treat your path level or your school ability as an ability. So you'd have your intelligence, your school ability, and your skill in the spell. As those go up, your chances of casting the spell successfully go up as well. So the difficulty threshold of a first level spell is going to be something relatively simple like a 3. As long as you can roll a 3 or better, you can get off that magic missile without a great deal of difficulty. If you want to put out a much bigger magic missile, you can push and possibly get a higher number, which will allow you to throw more missiles. Technically, it's not a direct analog, but it does keep the flavor of being a spellcaster and still having to think a little bit tactically on how you're going to spend your resources, which stays true to the core system, but does allow you to use elements from this other game. Hopefully that makes sense, that works for people. Also, the amount of hit points a creature has can directly be translated into how many dice that it takes to injure or disable a creature. For instance, a creature in Swords and Wizardry that has... We'll just look in the monster section real quick for probably the poster boy of these kind of games, the dragon. And we open it up and we look at a red dragon. Possibly one of the nastiest creatures you're likely to fight. A properly played red dragon can wreck an entire party. A red dragon has, in this game, on average, 9 to 11 hit dice. So, considering an average mean, I believe, uses 8-sided dice for the hit dice. So, 4.5 times 10. That's not a lot of hit points, is it? So, let's say a dragon on the higher side has 80 hit points. Then for that, it wouldn't be unreasonable to have a dragon required to take, say, break it down, 8 points, 8 levels of wounds before that dragon is dropped. Is that hard to do? If the dragon has good defenses, yes, it should be quite hard to do. Mostly, if the player's hurted at all, they're only going to be doing 1-point blows. It's going to take quite a bit for that to add up to hurt the dragon significantly. And if the number is high enough for the dragon's defense, there may be a lot of blows that are missed, just like when you fight a real dragon in these games. I haven't really thought about the breakdown, but I think that sounds actually fairly fair. A dragon should take a concerted effort or a series of really lucky blows in order to take them down. So the conversion, while it might take a little bit of work, wouldn't be too terrible. Also, with creatures that have lots of different abilities, I would take heed of my character creation to be your guide. Generally, most creatures are going to have a specialty, like for example, that dragon has its breath weapon. Yeah. It's going to have 3 things that it's good at. It's going to have a great defense, it's going to have some pretty nasty hand-to-hand attacks, maybe it has magic, so it would have its specialty in that. Maybe it's got, incredible knowledge, lore, and the more powerful the creature, the higher rank it is, it might have a couple more abilities. But never is it going to have a sheet of 30 different abilities that you're going to have to comb through to figure it out. This book has a paragraph and like 7 stats. That's all you need. And in my game, I want to be able to replicate that if that's all you need. Okay, so that's Swords and Wizardry and D&D-like games. Let's go to one that is highly involved in percentiles and simulation. Twilight 2000, version 2.2. This is by Frank Chadwick. This is the probably the poster child for a kind of post-apocalyptic. It's after the bombs have dropped in a World War III scenario, but not everything is as destroyed as is usually portrayed in post-apocalyptic movies. This has the relatively modern military of the time it was created, which 1980s military tech. This was done by GDW back in... well... Alright, it's not incredibly obvious, but I think, yeah, it's around that time. 1980s, I think. Maybe 90s? 1983! Okay, 1983. So, the military tech in here, you're looking at your big tanks. This is really before Desert Storm, or around that time. So, you're going to have weapons that are still fairly modern, but you're not going to have the ultra modern weapons. You know, not a lot of stuff with composites and things like that. You're still going to have Uzis and M16s and things that were common fare back in the day in movies and military. And if you're going to try to adapt a scenario from this into my game, you have to understand that in most cases, the attributes for the game go on generally a similar scale to Dungeons & Dragons. The top numbers, I believe, about 20, and the bottom numbers are down in the 3. So that wouldn't be terribly difficult to break down into D4, D6, D8, D10, D12. D12 would be something of, up in the 20s. Really high levels of strength or intelligence or what have you. Then you would have, I would say, somebody who's quite good, say 15, 16 would be an 8. Somebody who's fairly good, say 10, 12 would be a D6. Somebody who's subpar, D7 or a 7 or lower would be a D4. And this is a game with a lot of percentile skills. All of your skills are wrapped into... or no, actually, they weren't. Later on, they got turned into rounder numbers, which works, in my mind, a little bit better. And in that case, again, too, it's just a matter of breaking down the relative numbers into the same scale. So you can still use the same exact skills that are in a character creation in dice file, which would be, let's see if I can find the character sheet. So you would have skills such as chemistry, interrogation, intrusion, snow skiing, navigation, survival. Those are all things that could easily be represented as skills in the core game. So again, wouldn't be too hard. It's just figuring out where your relative scale is going to lie and applying that to the dice value. Now after that, and you have all the equipment and things. Okay, well, capacities don't really have to change. So the amount of weight that something, that's just a straight number. That doesn't really have to be a die value. But as far as, let's see, movement could be represented by a die in the vehicle scale lens. So that's something like and that would just be a matter of comparing. Obviously the wagon would be a D4, but if you have an M2A2 Bradley, which has a movement of 30, 25, 4. Not going to be your fastest vehicle compared to a civilian car, which has a comparative movement of 50/8. So your Bradley would probably be a D4 for a tracked military vehicle as far as its speed. If you're going to try to evade something, you're hindered by the fact it's not a particularly fast vehicle. As opposed to a civilian car that might have a speed of a D6 or even a D8, because it is much more maneuverable. You would just take the relative numbers that you have, figure out the range, top end to low end, and assign values, D4, D6, D8, maybe D10. At the top end, if you have something really, really fast, I would say like a European sports car, a Lamborghini, something that can go 200 miles an hour, would have a speed of 10 effectively. Maybe 12 if you like that skill. For gear and things like that, I generally relatively like a 10. But you can go with whatever scale you like. That is your privilege. Until I decide to make a source book for something like this. I make a dice file modern armor. And something like this would be a really good resource for that because, again, this really wanted you to have all of the different toys to use. Now, as far as the weapons went, say I look at the M16A2. It has a rate of fire, which you can represent by either increasing the damage rating. You generally don't want to roll multiple dice. You may say that firing a series of shots makes it more likely one of your bullets is going to hit, and therefore the difficulty drops if you open up with semi-automatic fire. Damage. Well, the damage of the M16A2 is a 3, which is pretty solid for assault rifles, as opposed to something like the Scorpion machine pistol, which has a damage rating of 1. 1 would very clearly be something that's appropriate to a D4. It's the lowest value, clearly. Would a 3 be a D6 or a D8? We can look through a little bit further and we can say, let's go up to machine guns. Machine guns probably give us a much more fun number. Let's see, these look like they are 4s for a PK, or a Mag L7A2 general purpose machine gun has a damage of 4. So I would say that might have a D8. That's actually pretty easy. D1, 2, 3, 4, D4, D6, D8, D10. Certainly, could be done. I'm looking for a really big machine gun though. And then we get into high explosives. Range, round, heat, damage, C6, B5. So yeah, something that's an RPG rocket would do, D10 quite clearly, high-end damage if you get hit by it. So translating would take a bit of work, clearly. So that means I need to make a source book for it. But it could be done by just understanding that the relativity between and then just looking at the numbers. Finally, we'll look at the last one that I have. A fully narrative game, The Princess Bride. This is based on Fudge, which, again, very simple, very abstract system. Fudge has different levels of intensity, proficiency, skill. It starts out at terrible and poor, really bad, which would be D4, your default. Then it goes up to mediocre and fair, which could be a D6. Then up to good, which I would say would probably be also about a D6 range. Then great, now you're looking at D8. If you're great at something, look out, people will notice, and a D8 level. And then you have superb, which would be a D10. There's actually an additional level of beyond superb, which is kind of legendary, and that could be a D12. Hey, that's really easy. And honestly, it is just that simple. And then you have various weapons. You have swords, and you have the like in combat. And they have their own rating. Basically, when you attack somebody, you roll 4 dice? 3 dice? No, 3 dice. Your weapon can either be rated as minimum, medium, or maximum. So when you roll 3 dice, the lowest value is the minimum, The medium value is the medium, and the highest value is the maximum. And your weapon can do that, and it might even be modified. Like maximum +1 would be a really dangerous weapon. And if there's a tie, it doesn't matter. It's still fine. So your medium and your maximum could be the same, or they could all be the same if you roll 3 of a kind. And it's generally about averages. So a weapon that has a high level of damage, like say the big pole axe, would be a weapon that does a D8 or a D10 damage. They have disadvantages to compensate, but if they hit, they hit. And whereas a sword would be your average, either a D6 or a D8, and something like a dagger, D4. Fairly straightforward. Nothing too complicated about swapping this. After that, though, really what's the only other mechanic for this is something like the but Grandpa weight points, which basically allow you to seize narrative control to save your character from a particularly dangerous scenario or something that goes against that goes badly for your character. It may spell doom. Well, that would be relatively simple. A grandpa weight die that everybody has, which would generally, the value would then be used as a marker. And if you get a higher level of but grandpa weight, then you would just diminish it. You would fatigue it. It might take a little bit of doing. You might say, for instance, that drawing on the but grandpa weight would allow you to roll the die, and if you rolled a 1, it would diminish the value of that die. Say a D6 would become a D4. If a D4 drops, then you can't use but grandpa weight anymore. That would be valid. I would have to really, think about it intelligently, give it a few thoughts, but honestly, it really wouldn't be all that hard to translate either. There's a couple things that come to mind, just straight up replacing the points with a die value. If you have a D8 in but grandpa weight and you use it, it drops down to a D6. It's basically the same thing as giving it 3 points, but just using dice, because it's dice file, and you can do that. But I would definitely rather roll that die for some meaning, and the bigger shenanigans you try to pull off might take a higher value, and sometimes maybe fate might just go and it doesn't work. That's contrary to the spirit of but grandpa weight points in The Princess Bride, however, so I'd have to think about it. But I think it would be wouldn't be very difficult to copy over. So in that way, a person who falls in love with my game, if you do, and you then look to other resources, converting, not terribly difficult. There will be a section in the final book on how to bring other resources in, and also as I do other expansions for it, it'll be sure to note other mechanics that other systems might use that you might want to try, of course adapted for dice file, but yeah, mechanics are something that you can't copyright, and some of them are just darn good ideas. And I want to lay things out for the users of the game to make their own determination on. So, hopefully this interests you. If you're not really into game design, you just want to pick up a game and use it, this probably wasn't your episode. But hopefully you got something out of it. Maybe a little bit more excited to take a look at something like Dice File and apply it to something else. Or the idea that you can take something like Dungeons and Dragons and adapt Twilight 2000 to Dungeons and Dragons. Somebody already did that. It's D20 Modern. They haven't done the 5th edition that I've seen yet, but it's probably only a matter of time since that system seems to be pretty successful. But reskinning and adapting isn't terribly difficult as long as you understand relative value. In my game, having only really 5 values, D4, D6, D8, D10, D12, makes adapting really simple as long as you just break everything down. You understand the full range and you just break it down. Pretty fairly easy to do. So, hope this helps, hope this whets your appetite, and hope you were entertained by this. I am kind of a geek for game concepts and game design, so I thank you for indulging me if you watched this video through to its completion. And until next time, tomorrow, the final video, although I will be doing a What We Learned video, a recap. then, and hopefully show you a bit of my work, that will be the end for the RPGaDay for 2020, and then we can get on to the final bit of horribleness for this year and hope for something better for next year. Hopefully. So, thank you very much. I will talk to all of you hopefully tomorrow. Until that time, farewell.